As far as where we left off last time, we spent a lot of time talking about structures, which another way you've kind of phrased the dimension approach is conscious attention to the structures we live by. It's kind of how you summed it up at the very end, was just that understanding of structures and how they work and whether or not they need to be deconstructed or constructed is essential to all the goals of the dimension approach. So last time we were kind of framing out or discussing how you framed out the dimension approach on the website and the goals of healing, performance, development, and awakening. That those are all essential to that is structures. And so, I mean, we could just keep going down that route because that feels like new territory as far as the podcast. It's not, I don't think it's even a term we've touched on specifically up to this point.
In the dimension approach, the way I'm using the word structure is in a really broad way, referring to the idea that consciousness gets structured in the same way that, not in the same way, but in an analogous way that, for example, the physical world, if you break it down, it used to be that we thought the atom was the basic unit or the basic building block. The most basic one we can sort of find with electron microscopes and stuff. It's like, okay, everything is built on that, right? That there's groupings of atoms, groupings of molecules that form various objects in the material world. For example, the shape and size of something is one thing, but then asking, well, what material is it, right? What kind of molecules is it made up of, or what are the elements that it's made of? If you look at the periodic table of elements, it's like what at any particular object, it's what elements does that have in it, and it's important in various ways. One of the ways is via the alchemy idea, where by way of analogy, spiritual alchemy was talking about how in the material world, at least so far, it's not possible to change one element into another element, right? So you can't take lead and then, do some kind of process in your laboratory and turn it into gold. And that's important, because if you could, we'd have to, like, gold would not have the meaning it does. But so structure is important when you look at it as, okay, there's some kind of basic unit, and then it gets organized into forms, into objects, into structures, and that structures have utility. So we live by structures. Everything functions by structures. It's an interesting thing because it gets into the existential postmodern argument, where it's like, it is the philosophy of life that there are existing structures that we live by, that we organize by, that we function by, or is it just wide open and you have some kind of free choice, right, to make decisions or choices? And for the person that says, for the postmodern existentialist that says it's all about freedom of choice and that you create your own meaning, et cetera, of course, the argument that comes to my mind against that is, what is this mechanism by which you're making choices, and what's really motivating your choices? And is that some kind of you that is absolute, that has some kind of absolute freedom? And so it's an interesting claim, because if you claim that, it's hard to claim then also that you're an atheist, or claim that you're a materialist or empiricist or positivist, because you're implying that there's some you that exists outside of pre-given structures. And it's like, what is this you you're talking about? And where is that? And how is it that that thing functions? Because I'd be interested in the ontology and the spirituality of that, right? And it's like, oh, you say there is no ontology. Well, it seems like it runs into a dead end. It's my view that in life in general, in society, in politics, in sociology, and certainly in the domains that I work in, meaning awakening, healing, development, and performance, in all those areas, we tend to operate largely as though it's all freedom of choice, or as though there aren't structures that are having massive influence. And it's across the board, whether it's in the area of awakening and you're working with higher states of consciousness, or you're meditating, or you're doing depth work or spiritual work, or you're doing psychedelics, or, and these various things that you're trying in order to have awakening experiences. There needs to be a look at structures. There needs to be a look at ego structures. There needs to be a look at this idea of ontological structures, and the idea that it's not just some absolutely wide open domain that each individual just has, again, some kind of free will to create in. So it's all the way from awakening down to the golf swing, right? Performing just some physical task. It's like, and I know I've said this in previous podcasts, but the golf swing, the correct golf swing, right? If we say there's a, within a certain given set of parameters, there's sort of a correct, agreed upon movement to the golf swing. And most people cannot perform the correct golf swing because their physical structure doesn't have the mobility to perform it. But that's not taken into account. So instead, it's go play 10,000 rounds of golf, swinging the wrong way, spend tons of money on golf lessons and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Drive yourself crazy, not getting better at golf, and no even recognition that your body literally cannot perform the function.
Just a quick aside, I have to ask, did you get burned by a golf instructor at some point? It's just it's the physical example, or do you've just had a lot of people that come into you to talk about golf, or what's the brief history of you and golf?
Right. Well, I've certainly spent my time on the golf course, on the verge of insanity because it's so frustrating. So there's that. And anybody who's played enough golf will tell you that, it drives you crazy. It's like when I was, I don't know, I was probably 12 or something at the time, but I was on a golf course playing, and I got paired up with these two guys that were in their 70s, I think. And, and I got these pearls of wisdom from the one guy where we're walking along, and he asks me how often I play. And I can't even remember what I told him, but it was something like, I don't know, every couple months or something I get out, or, it goes in spurts. And he said, son, golf is a game that you should play 3 times a week or 3 times a year, but anything in between and you will drive yourself crazy. And I came to realize he's right. You either need to have it be something you don't really care that much about and don't try to get better at, or you need to commit to it at least 3 times a week if you're going to get anywhere. So that's one of the reasons I go back to golf. Also I think golf is a thing that I mean, again, it plays into anything, certainly running, any activity.
Totally. It's funny. It's just tough to tell when you're talking about it, if you're talking to people that purport to have a perfect swing or purport to teach a perfect swing. It's always been tough to tell who your audience is. I don't know if you're talking to yourself or if you're talking to a client or a teacher or a golf pro, but you, but you're frustrated with them.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's all the. I mean, it's all of them, but certainly just the average golfer that's trying to get better and doesn't realize like it's a structural problem.
Right.
You're talking about, that these structures, it doesn't matter if it's awakening or something physical like a golf swing. If the structure is wrong, nothing's going to change. Or if the structure isn't suited to the task.
And I feel like it's one of the big things going on there is the thing I keep talking about, where the ego mind with its rationalizations and narratives and thought processes, how we tend to operate from there as though we're free of structures, as though we're autonomous, free acting, free thinking egos and bodies. And it's like, we're not, we're bound by structures and enabled by structures. And so to look at it that way, it is a big shift. And I think it's not some new shift. I think it's a shift back to the recognition of this, and so it's that whole thing of there's value in recognizing relativity, and there's value in recognizing, that all narratives are relative. So the idea of meta narratives, the postmodern view that, there's an infinite number of narratives and therefore sort of invalidates meta narratives in some kind of absolutist way. It's like, okay, but depending on what you're trying to do, you still need to use the narrative, or you still need to use a structure, right? You need to use it. It's like the idea that they say that, well, most, quantum physics, one of the insights is that even what we consider to be very dense objects, they're mostly empty space. And it's like, okay, great, but that doesn't mean you can now just walk through walls. You can take those insights way too far. So structures in the mind, for example, are huge. And in the field of psychotherapy, that used to be what it was based on, meaning psychotherapeutic theory was structural theory. And so that term, quote unquote, structural theory, and the general idea was that we build or develop structures in our mind that we live by, that we operate by, that we experience via, and that the growth process, the process of the development of a self, et cetera, involved structures. And so if the general progression as far as schools of thought went from psychoanalysis to ego psychology to self-psychology and object relations theory, each of these were different ways of talking about structure, right? And there was the idea of intrapsychic structure, meaning structures that an individual has in their mind, and then the idea of interpersonal relating or interacting. And there was debate, as I mentioned last time, Freud versus Fairbairn. The general idea was Freud talked more about an individual's psyche creating structures in relation to their body or their id or their unconscious energies, right? That the unconscious was there and it was all unruly and disorganized and chaotic. And if it surfaces rather without the ego doing enough structuring, then you get schizophrenia, right? You get anxiety, you get chaos. So the ego develops structures that organize the unruly id, unconscious body energies, and then a person operates via those structures. And then that was the drive model, meaning these energies are in the forms of drives. And Fairbairn's idea was that there aren't drives. It was that this chaotic, unstructured, unorganized energy just stayed in that kind of state. And today we would label that more of a quantum state. And that the mind, he didn't put it in quantum language, but if you sort of translated it into quantum language, it would be that the mind collapses those energies into form. And so it's the combination of the energies and the mind that then create, if you will, or bring into form a certain structure. So it's two different ideas on how the structure comes about, but from there forward, there's a lot of agreement about it. And there's also disagreements. But what I'm getting at is it was all about structures. It was all about what are the structures that form and what's the functionality of those structures. And so then when you shift to, ego psychology, it was like, well, it's all about looking at ego structures. When you move to self-psychology, it was all about what are the structures that are determining this person's experience of self. Object relations theory. An object relation is a structure in the mind that is a relational structure, meaning it formed via interpersonal relations and it functions as a way of experiencing self via interpersonal relations, meaning via the structure in your mind and how it relates to others. So structure was huge. And the idea, again, was, it started with this whole idea of the discovery of the unconscious. It was, all right, the big shift was, hey, humans are motivated by stuff that they're not even aware of, right? That was the big shift. Instead of you're not behaving right, or you're not thinking right, or you're not functioning right, and that's your fault and you need to do it different. It's like, well, wait a minute, I don't even know who I am. I don't even know what makes me go. All I know is I got all these urges and desires and fears, and aggressions, and I'm sort of able to manage myself, but I'm sort of not. And it's like, can we admit that in ourselves? And it's a huge shift. Freud was a medical doctor, and it was like, wait a second. A lot of so-called misbehavior or maladies that people had, Freud was saying, hey, some of this stuff isn't biology, which is what the medical industry focused on, right, is biology. Freud was saying, wait a minute, some of this stuff is psychology. Some of these so-called diseases or maladies that people suffer. And so, yeah, there was the movement in that direction from biology to psychology. But there was also, simultaneously, it was a shift from like the oppressive idea of religion and of the state as far as a more compassionate stance towards the individual and the individual's dysfunctions. Right? It was saying, listen, as far as psychology, when we look at psychology, a person's so-called dysfunctions aren't necessarily conscious choices, which is huge, right? That's a massive paradigm shift. For example, if you take it into politics and economics, it's like, look, it's not always an unwillingness to work. Sometimes it's an inability to work. Right? It's not always an unwillingness to function according to societal norms. Sometimes it's an inability to, which is huge. And I think we've gotten away from it. I think we've gone back to this idea that, well, you just need to change your mind. You just need to see it different. You just need to adopt a different paradigm, and then you'll be on your way. And it's like, wait a second. What are the structures that individual is working from? And that individual didn't necessarily consciously create their own structures. We're all sitting here as a result of experiences we've had that created structures that weren't our own cognitive, rational doing. Right?
Never chose them.
And so to admit that is to admit it's quite a disempowerment initially. Is to recognize like, wow, I'm looking at the world and I'm experiencing self through lenses that I'm not even sure what the other options are. But understanding structures it goes a long way towards helping us understand what's going on and why, and what kind of change is possible, and what kind of structures can be put in place, and certainly in the realm of individual psychology, there's so much stuff that is structurally motivated, structurally caused. And it's a really difficult situation because getting structural change in psychology is no easy task. It's not like, oh, you can just identify the structure and now you can change it. It's a huge ordeal trying to change structure, just like it's a huge ordeal trying to change physical structure. But having an understanding of the structures or the lack of structures that you're working with, at least sets you on a course towards having a more accurate understanding of what's happening. So just to explain structures, again, I'm using the term really broadly. And so it's like when I'm talking physical structure, one of the things I mean, and I think one of the ways that you define quote unquote structural body work is body work where you're trying to affect structure, meaning you're not just trying to help someone feel good. You're not just trying to increase fluid exchange through the muscles. You're not just trying to get the actin myosin filaments to come out of a contracted state. You're actually trying to get change in the length and or elasticity and positioning of the structural elements of the body. So primarily that'd be the musculoskeletal system, but it would be about bones and fascia way more than about muscle tissue. In the same way that if you're making changes to your home, it's like there's cosmetic stuff. If you get a different rug or a different couch, or even if you paint the walls, that's not really that wouldn't be structural stuff. If you're going to move a wall, that's a different deal. Now we're talking structural. Is that a support wall? Is there a support structure in that wall that you're moving, or is there not? So structure can be made up of various things. I'm saying fascial tissue and bones are two big ones in the human body. If you move into the mind, now it moves into the immaterial realm, and it's like, okay, what is a psychic structure? And it's like, well, it'd be more analogous to a program in a computer. So in the same way that computer programming works, and these programs get created, and then data or information now sort of get run through a program. Our mind seems to work that way, where our brain and our mind develops programs. And again, who decides these programs and stuff? It's typically thought, it's this combination of everything from genetics to, some people think, past lives or karma, but certainly there's some element of nature and there's some element of nurture, meaning there's to some degree it's experience with the world and experience with others that determines the development of structures. As I've said before, just like with computers, we all tend to walk around and think that our mind has all the programs. If we use the computer analogy, it has all the updates and it has all the latest software, and it's sort of working in some kind of complete 100% way with regard to everything in the universe. Right. And so no matter what is brought up as a topic, it's like, well, I think that, and I think, and it's like, shut up. You don't, and I'm saying that to myself too. It's like, shut up. You don't have any freaking clue what you're talking about.
Right. It's a hard balance.
It is.
And then it's also, but like the first examples that come to mind for me are when other people do it too, like it's not, my first inclination isn't to put myself in that role, but it happens all the time.
And it's like, well, so let's say we all shut up and admit we don't know anything. It's like, then what? Well, we can't just do that. So, but again, recognizing that, okay, we're bound by this stuff. And I think on the good side, I think on the positive end, this idea of trying to recognize unconscious bias or implicit bias, I think is a good. There's the good element of that. I think it's being used in a way that's inappropriate and actually damaging. But I think that the impetus behind that, is a good one as far as recognizing that, okay, we're motivated by things and we don't even realize it. But so if you say, okay, on a physical level, it's stuff like fascia and bones, that's not just a set system. Fascia and bones have huge plasticity. And if you say, okay, the human mind develops structures that are analogous to computers programs, but there's also huge plasticity there, right? They're incredibly resilient at times, but they're also incredibly changeable. In the subtle energetic realm, you have the structures are, chakras are structures, right? dantians are structures. You have channels, you have meridians, you have all these different, if you start talking subtle energetic anatomy, those are the structures, right? But then that said, within, it gets super complex. Within a certain chakra, people build structures. And so in the same way that in the fascial tissue, you can develop a tension or a tightness or a what people will call a knot in their tissue, or adhesions, right? It's like in the subtle field, you get contractions, you get blockages, you get structures formed. And some of those structures have, or they always have, their utility. But, the general idea, again, with structural work is, okay, where has there been a failure to develop necessary structures, and or where have there been structures that were compensatory or defensive, or are now in the way of performance or development or healing or awakening. And so again, this idea of clearing your chakras or balancing your chakras, I think that's such a simplified idea, because there's an extremely complex system that is a structural system in the subtle field.
So clearing, because this is something you said before, as far as a term that people, like, is there a way of using that term that you think is appropriate? Or do you think it's just generally just a phrase that people use regardless, that isn't really clearing the chakras? Is there a sentiment there that you understand that you feel is being misexpressed? Or is it
in general, I think it's useless, but I understand. It's like if you say, just wait, let me clear my mind for a second. Right. It's like, okay, that's a very state-specific thing that really isn't, you're not really clearing your mind out, right? But you might be going into a state where you're allowing yourself to orient to a more open space or something. I don't understand what clearing your chakras would be with regard to some actual.
But could it be? But because you don't think people mean just bringing awareness to a specific chakra or looking from that. They don't mean that. They mean like some purification process that you feel can't be done in an afternoon.
It can't be done in 10,000 lifetimes. Because I still think that's how it works, I feel like it's worse than if I say, let me clear my cells. It's like, well, what the hell does that mean?
Right. Lots of water.
Okay, in the imaginal realm, if we say the imaginal realm is structured, one common way, now it's quiz time, Jeff. What would be an imaginal realm structure?
See, quizzes are hard.
Yeah.
There's daemons. Yep. Would you call those structures? Because I guess the hard part with imaginal realm is it's so hard mentally to think about. I think of it as internal versus external, or external forces acting, but you think about them coming from below.
But they don't just come in the shape. So the idea of the imaginal realm is they don't just come in the imaginal realm. They're not just in the form of sort of formless energy, right? They seem to organize into forms via our imaginal mind.
Seem to have a will. Yeah. Right. Seem to have a will separate from, at least initially, especially something that's not conscious, a will separate from personal will, or daemons, spirits, archetypes. What's the one I'm thinking about? The Greek gods, or the personifications of these ideas, or these spirits, or these drives in the world. Things that seem to have ends in mind that aren't my own, or aren't that I don't necessarily claim, but I can feel that drive either in the world or in myself.
No, I think that's well put.
Well, it's just, you say it's like a trigger word, man. Quiz.
I know. Jesus. You just went completely blank.
Yeah, I was like, it's like a nightmare, You wake up, it's like, oh God, no, I don't have a test today. I'm done with school.
So yeah, the imaginal realm, the idea is, how's it structured, right? And it's like, well, the general idea is it's structured into, just like you said, these forms, these creatures, these spirits, these entities, these mythological characters, these archetypes, these daemons. And like you're saying, there's an experience. The ego mind has an experience of that those forms are other. But so if we shift to conscious structures or ontological structures, right? If we're gonna use these categories that I've been trying to force into a system that I call the dimension approach, the idea with conscious structures or ontological structures is, it implies that, wait a minute, this so-called spiritual world or mystical world or esoteric world, first of all, it's implying that there is one, right? Or that there are many, and that they're structured, that it's not some wide open, empty, or one unity state situation, but that they're, if the shift to the conscious from ego is a shift to ontology as opposed to just phenomenology, right? And that's another deep topic that we've touched on some. But there's the idea of soul, and if you say soul is a conscious structure, it's an ontological structure, and that's in the work that I do and the understanding I feel like I have. I don't really go past soul. I think there are infinite structures beyond soul, infinite layers, infinite levels beyond soul, but I don't have awareness, up there. But I am saying I do feel like I have a certain awareness of soul versus ego and of individual souls. And if you say the soul is an individual consciousness structure of a being, and what is a being? Well, I don't know. All I know is that what it seems like is individual beings show up in what we call reality, even though I think what we're calling reality is a limited thing. For example, if we say the universe, well, I think there's stuff beyond the universe, but the universe is a three-dimensional linear space-time phenomenon, right? And if we say that that's a certain box, beings show up in the universe or in this reality as souls. So soul is a structure, and the being presences itself in reality as a soul. So again, that's, you can take that or leave it, whatever. It's but if you're going to be in the dimension approach cult, you have to adopt that as your
as your vague way of saying that when you look at someone else in a space, they exist.
Right.
I just want to say, it's a pretty low bar to accept. It's just a different way of saying it.
It sounds real fancy, but the actual acceptance is not that big a deal. But you have to use the words that I'm saying,
Oh no, I think everybody knows that's the real hurdle.
Okay, but then if you say, well, wait a minute, okay, so fine, even if you accept that there's a soul, now I'm going to say you got to go even further if you're going to maintain your membership. The soul is structured in various ways. For example, the soul has its own mind, if you will, that's like saying the ego. There's the ego, but the ego has a mind, right? Just like there's an ego body. There's an ego body and an ego mind, right? Consciousness has a mind, if you will, that isn't just the presencing being. There's this structure, this mechanism that is the conscious mind, which a lot of people say is the third eye. And that structure of the soul has a certain utility. It's there for a reason, and it performs certain functions. So to just show up and presence oneself as soul is one thing, and we can all do that to a degree, and we all do it to varying degrees, moment to moment. But then it's okay, but how much soul presence are you bringing into your voice, into your heart, into your sexuality, into your physicality, into your rational mind? And the whole dimension approach methodology thing is about, via the conscious mind, you can take soul presence and focus it into this realm that we call reality or the universe or whatever, And the conscious mind can perform who knows how many different activities with it. I'm sure they're infinite. But the five that, that I'm putting labels on that apply to human performance, development, awakening, healing are witnessing, holding, containment, mirroring, contact. So the conscious mind is focusing in a particular way and bringing conscious attention in. But so my point is, it's a structure. So there's soul structures, and the conscious mind is one of them. And then, as I've said before, I really like the diamond approach and Almas, how he labels them. I use a lot of words that he uses. He has his mapping of it. He takes it largely from Sufism. This idea that essence points are soul structures, if you will. And what's different about a soul structure, again, is that it's ontology. It's still of the soul realm versus of the ego realm. So just by way of analogy, if you're talking about water vapor, for example, if you said that was soul realm and it seems rather structureless, right? And it's rather invisible to us, but then it condenses into liquid, for example, and it's like, oh, it formed a structure now. It's like, yeah, but that's still water, right? And it would be, okay, soul structures are still soul, but they've condensed into a certain structure, right? Or crystallized or whatever. But they're still soul realm. And then if you say, okay, but then if they go another gradation of structuring, then it turns into ego, and now it's no longer ontological. Now it's phenomenological. So there's some kind of shift that happens, and then you can say, well, ultimately it's all still soul, it's all still consciousness, it's like, right, but there are these shifts that happen, just like from gas to liquid to solid. There's these thresholds at which it changes. So an ice cube is still water, but it behaves very different than liquid does or than gas does, obviously. Well, I've found it very valuable to recognize soul structures and to discern and notice, my conscious mind versus my ego mind, or someone else's conscious mind versus the ego mind, or certain essential aspects or essential points in their system. And that bringing conscious attention to an essential point in someone else's system has profound effects, which I came to be aware of little by little in my practice, and developed more and more of an understanding and a sensitivity to that. And then the reason I come back to Almas so much is because a handful of years into that process of seeing these things and noticing the changes and developing a way of working with it on my own, I found Almas's work, and it was like, oh my God, he's talking about this stuff, and he's got it all mapped out in a huge way. And then he's saying, my mapping's a simplification of the Sufist mapping. But modern society doesn't look at that at all. So structures, ontological structures and or consciousness structures, mental structures, imaginal structures, subtle structures, physical structures, to awakening, healing, development, and performance are hugely dependent upon these structures. And understanding these structures, understanding how they work, understanding the utility they have, understanding how they get formed or how they fail to get formed, is the science of structural bodywork, is the science of structural psychology or structural psychotherapy, is the science of imaginal work, alchemy, shamanism, et cetera, is the science of subtle energetic work. And when I say is the science, I mean it is the existing understanding in a cognitive rational way, right? It's the way we've mapped and organized and labeled these things. And again, it's all being just kind of left behind in the name of free choice, free will, and the absolute power of the ego conceptual idea of selfhood. And I think it's a shame. And so the work I do and what I'm calling the dimension approach, and I know I keep saying it, but it's like I didn't invent anything. I'm not claiming some new thing. I'm just putting words to it because I'm feeling like, okay, over time what I noticed is this common threads one of them being consciousness, one of them being structures. And it was like, oh my God, these structures, whether physical, emotional, mental, subtle, imaginal, or conscious, it's like, well, how do you get change in those structures? And it's like, there's all kinds of ways. Like I just said, there's all kinds of science, there's all kinds of methodologies, there's all kinds of mappings and stuff. But it's like, when it comes down to it, what really is like the key element that gets change in structure and that affects structure? And it's like, it's consciousness. It's consciousness. And and to me, that was just, I mean, it was just mind blowing in my psyche to come to see that, and to see that that's not only a neat idea, but that it is that I was able to and am able to implement it in everything I do in my life. And so not only was it what helped me go from not being able to do athletics anymore to doing an Ironman, it's not only what made me go from suicidal depression to not, but clinically, I started getting change with clients that was profound and exciting. And of course, it's continued to evolve and develop and deepen. But that basic insight that it's about consciousness and it's about structure has remained, and that's why the nifty little tagline under the website page says conscious attention to the structures we live by, because that's my attempt to sum it up.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.